Hey everyone, what's going on? I am Tim Berzins from Amplified Vitality, and in today's video we're going to be discussing how endotoxin can be related to weight gain, and actually a theory that we've kind of been batting around in the scientific realms about how endotoxin actually could be the primary cause for weight gain through the processes of inflammation and all of that good stuff. Ties really well into all the metabolism stuff that we usually talk on here, and it's going to help to solve a lot of these little quirks that a lot of people run into when they try to switch to a bioenergetic diet, switching to that higher metabolism diet based more on fruits and sugars, saturated fats, and all of those things. It's not always a smooth transition, and the bacteria and the endotoxin help to kind of give you a bridge to help you understand what is going on and why it's happening. So with all of that, before we get started, I want to let all of you know that the November edition of the Amplified Vitality monthly newsletter is live on my Patreon account. You can click the link below to go check that out. The November edition is amazing. It's filled with so much good content. And there's even a news section in there where I take 5 of the best questions that I received on my YouTube channel and I expand them into full articles. So I'm going to go back and post on those comments and let you know which ones were included in the newsletter. But you're going to want to check that out because it gives you such a broader depth of those questions that you all have. That's going to really give you a deeper insight into what's actually going on with your metabolism, with your health, with your physiology, all of that good stuff. So if you're really interested in that, you definitely want to go check it out. It's in the Patreon account, like I said, linked in the About section of this video. All right, now let's dive into the endotoxin theory of weight gain and what all of this is based on. So as a quick little primer, when we're talking about endotoxin, what we're really talking about is the microbiome. Your gut bacteria in your microbiome, in your large intestine, are made up of a diverse colony of different communities of bacteria that are all interplaying off of each other, all digesting different types of foods and producing these different byproducts. I have a couple other videos where I talk about gut health and I talk about this, but I don't talk about endotoxins specifically, and that's what this video is really going to address, especially in relation to weight gain. So as we see with our modern diets that are starting to become more junk food oriented, become less wholesome, less full of, all the fiber and the nutrients we get from fruits and vegetables and all of those things, we're starting to see less variety in the types of bacteria that live in the microbiome, and that's having massive consequences on our health. In a normally healthy individual, a normally healthy organism, especially those that we would see in a more natural setting, in more of a tribal setting, living on the land, living in the wild, we have a very vast and diverse microbiome community. There's many different types of bacteria living there, and these are all interplaying on each other, keeping each other in balances with checks and balances and those kind of things. And preventing some of the negative consequences we see when one particular type of bacteria becomes too much, too populated, and having those really bad effects that come from that. But in addition to that, it's not just about the types of bacteria we have, it's also about the quantity. So we can almost think about this as quality and quantity, and both of those obviously matter. So when we see in conditions like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, that the bacterial load has grown so high and so excessive that it's actually started to creep up into the small intestine. Usually bacteria is only found in the large intestine, maybe a little bit in the small intestine, but not too much there. What happens in this situation is that we're feeding the bacteria so much that they begin to propagate and flourish more than they're normally supposed to, and they actually start to populate the small intestine where they usually wouldn't be. Now, obviously, this has huge implications because the small intestine is where almost all of the nutrient absorption happens when we're eating this food. The surface area from the villi and the microvilli spread out would cover the area of a tennis court. So there's this rich network of these capillaries and blood vessels that normally are absorbing nutrients. But if there's this infection, quote unquote, of these bacteria all up in your small intestine, then your small intestine won't be absorbing the nutrients that you eat. And instead, you're feeding the bacteria, they're processing them, and then the metabolic byproducts are being leaked into your bloodstream. One of the things that I talked about in a previous video was someone who infected themselves with alcohol-forming yeast, and then whenever he would eat carbohydrates or really any food, he would become drunk because of those byproducts. The same thing's happening with lactic acid-producing bacteria, which are dumping that lactic acid into your blood and literally creating a physiological state that's similar to after a workout. So every time you eat, if you're stressing your body with that fatigue, making it feel like it's just had a workout, you can make a good bet that that's going to turn into a stressed out system, the chronic low-grade inflammation that's never healed from. There's no adaptation response to that. You're just continuing to cause friction and stress within this normally operating respiratory system. So as we can see with this, we definitely want to keep the bacterial load lower and not let it go up into the small intestine. What we can start to see is that it actually is a situation where we have the host, which is the human organism, and a symbiotic relationship with the bacteria that live in the large intestine. I say symbiotic because there actually is some studies showing that with a germ-free environment, the immune system of the host or of the person, of the human organism, is reduced. So clearly there is some interaction here that could be beneficial. However, there are also a lot of studies showing that in these same models, these same animal models, that a completely germ-free environment, meaning completely sterile microbiome, that when these organisms eat food, that they can eat as much as they want, they can have sugar, they can have fat, they can have all the protein that they want and not gain weight. Even eating really, really large amounts, they will not gain any weight at all. Their systems will be good, no inflammation, and everything works fine. However, as soon as they take those same organisms and they add back in their native bacterial load within the microbiome, what they end up finding is that on much less food, these organisms will now gain weight. So of course the original theory was, well, the bacteria must be helping them to utilize the nutrients and therefore have the effect on the body of gaining the weight, because clearly we all know that fat gain is just about more calories than your body needs. But of course, that's a backwards way of looking at it, because the animals that had no bacteria were still healthy. They were still able to produce all the energy that they needed and still have proper nutrition. Maybe they were lacking in certain immune system functions, maybe they were lacking in certain vitamins, but on the whole, they were still definitely absorbing this nutrition. However, when we start to look at it as the endotoxin that is produced from those bacteria causing inflammation, and therefore that inflammation causing the weight gain, what we end up seeing is that a lot of puzzle pieces start to click in and make sense, because these bacteria are actually causing friction and resistance within the respiratory system. If the respiratory system, this respiratory network of your mitochondria that are producing energy, if that's allowed to work without anything stopping it, even if you were to eat an excessive amount of calories, all of them would get burned through your system or stored as glycogen or even released as heat, as uncoupling protein will not actually store the energy produced from glucose metabolism into ATP, which is the cellular currency of energy, but instead will just release it as heat. So even in this situation, you could be eating all these nutrients and just releasing extra heat and not necessarily putting yourself into a situation where you're going to store it as fat. However, as soon as we throw in that inflammation coming from the endotoxin, now all of a sudden the organisms start to gain weight, start to gain fat. And so what we can start to see is that friction in this normal healthy metabolism, which we could call the stress metabolism, moving into the inflammation state, moving into the stress state, moving out of the respiration state, and putting our bodies in a situation where they're not able to produce energy efficiently and utilize glucose the way they're supposed to, that is actually what triggers this adaptive protective response against the inflammation, which is why you would store fat. So if we actually look at the physiology of this, it actually starts to make a lot of sense. Let's start with the organisms that were completely germ-free, completely no bacteria in their microbiome. Now they eat the food, they have glucose, they have fatty acids, and they have protein, amino acids dumping into their bloodstream. As soon as it gets in the bloodstream, their cells absorb them, they utilize them, producing carbon dioxide. They're producing plenty of energy, refilling ATP stores, and like I said, maybe even just completely uncoupling and the proteins responsible for energy production, and therefore just releasing them as heat. All of this is happening. There's no need to store any fat because it's all just, the system is just running properly. And now we add the bacteria in, and what do we see? We end up seeing that the food that is normally digested and absorbed in the small intestine, which would go to the cells with no problem and be burned or stored or whatever needs to be done, now this food is not actually simply being absorbed, but it's actually feeding these bacteria in the small intestine. So it's feeding these bacteria in the small intestine, which are now metabolically processing them and creating these metabolic byproducts, which are basically, if you want to think about it, the bacteria's poop. The bacteria eat the foods that we're supposed to be absorbing, poop out these metabolic byproducts, which we then absorb, which then have physiological effects within our body. So the primary ones that I've already said are endotoxin and lactic acid. So if endotoxin is being released, endotoxin is lipopolysaccharide. It's a toxin produced from these bacteria that your liver now has to handle, and it has all these negative effects on insulin resistance and weight gain and all of these things. These endotoxins are being released into the bloodstream, and now whatever glucose or whatever fatty acids or protein, whatever it is that you're absorbing into your system is also being absorbed with endotoxin, which is dampening the function of your liver, dampening the ability of your body to function properly, and causing this spike in adrenaline and cortisol, which releases those free fatty acids, blocking the glucose from getting into the cell, and as we've talked about in so many other videos, spiraling down into that stress metabolism, all from this inflammatory endotoxin being released from those bacteria. Now the question that you might ask is, are all bacteria bad? Are all the metabolic byproducts bad? And the answer is no. There are some quote-unquote good bacteria that produce these short-chain fatty acids, which actually improve insulin sensitivity and help. And like I said, they also produce those vitamins like vitamin B12 or the K vitamins, and also help to increase the immune function of the organism itself, which is what I said before when some of these germ-free species actually don't have strong immune systems. And so really we can start to see that with this diverse culture of these multiple different bacteria that are normally present, all of them will keep each other in balance. But when we start to kill off certain ones or selectively feed certain ones over the others, now these quote unquote bad bacteria, these endotoxin producing bacteria, will proliferate and flourish and grow far more than they're supposed to, so that every time that you eat, now these bacteria are almost overtaking the host. The host of the organism is supposed to be in a symbiotic relationship with this bacteria, but if the host starts to become weak, now the opportunist bacteria will now start to propagate more and more and more and start to take over the host. This is exactly what we see in the stress metabolism, and it really starts to make sense that this could actually be one of the core fundamental aspects of why the stress metabolism even comes on in the first place, because the opportunistic bacteria start to take over when the actual organism starts to fail. The organism only fails when it's under stress and when it doesn't recover from that stress. Short-term stresses obviously help to create more resiliency as you heal, but if you never heal from it, now these bacteria start to gain a foothold and start to take over your digestive system. They're taking over the digestive system, so now when you're eating food, you're not really getting it. You're feeding them, and they're producing these inflammatory substances that continue to push your metabolism down and down and down, leading to more and more weight gain. So especially when we're in this stress metabolism and these organisms have their foothold, the question you might be asking is, how can we shift the system back to normal? And it becomes this real struggle, because every time you eat, to try to reinforce the strength of your organism to fight off these bacteria that have taken over, they're stealing the food from you. And so how can you nourish yourself if they continually steal the food from you? And there's a couple different tricks we can do. The most natural one would just be eating more raw carrots. This is a big Ray Peat suggestion for all of you who are familiar with Dr. Raymond Peat. He recommends doing the carrot salad, and that helps to lower the bacterial load in your microbiome and helps to lower the endotoxin production. This is a great recommendation. I do love this recommendation, and I think for the long term, it's probably the best one. But there are quicker fixes, and one of the ones that I like the most, which is still semi-natural for the most part, it's not going all the way into the harsher aspects like antibiotics, which also do work in a lot of people. But one simpler option is to do a activated charcoal cleanse. So the activated charcoal cleanse is basically taking somewhere between 50 and 30 grams of activated charcoal first thing in the morning on an empty stomach. Activated charcoal is really good at adsorbing, which means that it attaches molecules to the outside of the molecules of activated charcoal, binding them and moving them through your system to eliminate them. So obviously, if we can do that with a bacteria, we can bind all of the bacteria and start to move it out, creating this wave of suppression for the bacterial system, which now gives us, as the human organism, the opportunistic advantage to start to heal, to start to raise our strength, therefore prevent the bacteria from coming back. Now, a way that I actually like to ramp this up even higher is to add some extra antimicrobial nutrients to this to enhance the effect of that activated charcoal. And one of the best ones for that is the antimicrobial fatty acids found in coconut oil. So you could consume just straight up coconut oil and then take the activated charcoal, and you might have a good effect. However, in a stressed out metabolism, usually the digestive fluids aren't really working right, so you're not really going to be digesting them quite as well. So what I really like to do is take the coconut oil and do something called oil pulling with it for about 10 minutes. Basically what this means is that you're going to put coconut oil in your mouth, swish it around for about 10 minutes, and then swallow it. Most oil pooling recommendations say not to swallow the oil because there's a sort of ubiquitous idea that you're somehow pulling toxins out of your mouth and then you don't want to swallow the toxins, so you spit it out. I've never really seen much to support this idea, but what I have seen is the idea that the salivary lipase will break down the free fatty acids in the coconut oil into their free fatty acid components so that now they have these antimicrobial effects when swallowed. So if you swallow those free fatty acids, the MCT oils, the lauric acid, and all those other good fatty acids that are found in coconut oil, and then you take the activated charcoal, now the activated charcoal is going to pull them all through your system, having this antimicrobial effect throughout your entire gut. And then also the activated charcoal will obviously still be binding those bacteria and taking them out of the system in addition to that. So it creates this really powerful stimulus against the bacteria for your body. Now, of course, the next question that comes up is, don't we want some bacteria? Well, first of all, like I said, having a more germ-free environment, a more sterile colon, a more sterile microbiome is usually associated with much better health benefits. Like I said, these animals that were completely germ-free were actually able to respirate their nutrients much more properly, didn't have any weight gain, didn't have inflammation, and they were just far healthier overall. And in fact, a lot of pig farmers will actually use antibiotics to try to sterilize the pig guts to help them to grow when they're growing them for feed. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to be germ-free, but as we're going to see is there's actually a much better way to do that by instilling the good bacteria in your gut. And the way that these good bacteria work is actually to ultimately reduce the total bacterial load as well, because the negative endotoxin producing bacteria will proliferate and expand at a very, very high rate if not kept in check. But if you're feeding the good bacteria, those good bacteria will compete with those endotoxin producing bacteria, suppressing their growth and keeping everything in balance. So ultimately, feeding these good bacteria will help. And like I said, they also have those benefits of the immune system and the B12 production and the K production and all that other good stuff. So the way that we usually feed these good bacteria is through prebiotic fibers, through the soluble fibers that are fermentable by the bacteria. Things like inulin and pectin and beta-glucans, all these other different soluble fibers that those bacteria can eat. And what they've actually found is that high sugar meals and high fat meals on their own will release a lot of endotoxin into a normal system. And the reason is because you're feeding all those really bad bacteria, which are now producing the endotoxins, which are now proliferating and having this negative effect and pushing your body into a more state of fat gain. But of course, I've talked about so many times on this channel how great saturated fat is for you, how great sugar and fructose are for you. So what's going on here? Well, fructose and the sugars and the saturated fatty acids are all such powerful stimulants for an organism to help it to grow and to help it to nourish itself and all of this good stuff. But if the bacteria are eating them, the bacteria are getting that nutrition and that flourishment and therefore growing, and you're getting the endotoxin and the byproducts. You're eating second, so to speak. You're not the alpha anymore. The bacteria have started to take you over, and now you're beta to the bacteria, which are now running the system, so to speak. However, if we can eat a food that is rich in these fibers and also things like antioxidants and polyphenols, then those will help to keep the gut microbiome in check and help to feed the good bacteria that produce those short-chain fatty acids and some of the other materials that we want, and therefore promote a more diverse colony that helps to suppress the negative endotoxin producing bacteria. Now, in this situation, this is when sugar and saturated fat are really, really good for you because your organism is using them instead of the bacteria using them. And so what they found is that if you were to have just plain sugar water, you would release a lot of endotoxin. But if you have a glass of orange juice, which has those polyphenols and some soluble fiber, then you won't produce any endotoxin despite the fact that you're consuming just as much sugar. So again, this all points back to one of the basic philosophies I always talk about, which is sticking more towards the whole food sources as much as you can. Staying away from pure sugar and instead having an apple or having a banana, because the fibers in there, the polyphenols and the antioxidants are going to have this really powerful effect on keeping your gut microbiome balanced. Now, if you're able to do this while you're also doing the activated charcoal cleanse, and if you're adding the coconut oil into that, it's even more powerful, then you're going to find that you're slowly reducing the total bacterial load in your microbiome, therefore reducing the amount of endotoxin being released into your system after each meal, therefore reducing the growth of the bacteria and instead getting the nutrition yourself, therefore increasing the strength of the human organism while decreasing the strength of the bacterial organism. And when you're eating fiber and fruit and all these really good natural foods in the face of a situation like that, you're going to start feeding the good bacteria, and slowly but surely you're starting to regain control of your system rather than giving it away to these negative bacteria that we don't want to be running the show. Now, as far as probiotics go, probiotics being planting new bacteria to re-diversify the microbiome, to add some new different cultures and new different species into the system, probiotics can help, but you got to think about it this way. Probiotics are basically like a seed that you can plant in the ground. But if you plant a seed in shitty soil with really bad conditions and you don't take care of the plant at all, then you could plant as many seeds as you want and really not going to grow many at all, especially given the fact that you might be planting a lot of other negative seeds that are overtaking the positive seeds. So what we really want to do is take care of the environment first by doing things like eating more natural foods, using the activated charcoal or the carrots to help to clear out the excess. It's basically like if you imagine your garden is covered in weeds, well, you want to pull the weeds out before you plant the new seeds. And when you plant the new seeds, then you want to feed them. You want to give them water. You want to give them all the nutrients that they need to grow. So the same thing's happening in the gut microbiome. Pull the weeds first, then you can use some probiotics and you can help to grow the garden the way that you want, the way that's going to be beneficial, the way that's going to cause all the health benefits that we want. Now, of course, one last point that's really important here is that while we have lost a lot of different strains of bacteria, and while probiotics can help to resupplant them into our system, into our gut microbiome, you actually do get a lot of these bacteria naturally found in fruits. For example, an apple has something like 100 million live organisms within it, so it has the bacteria itself, and so when you're eating this fruit, you're naturally getting that anyway, and you won't necessarily need to supplement with a probiotic. But given all this, we can start to see how it's the inflammation and it's the endotoxin that is creating the necessity for your body to store fat by creating this deranged metabolism that prevents glucose from getting into the cells, it prevents respiration, and it basically hurts your overall health. On top of that, if your liver can't handle all the endotoxin being released, one of the ways that it can help to reduce the amount of load on the liver is to simply store those endotoxins away in the fat cells. This is basically what happens with diabetes and insulin resistance, where there's too much glucose in the blood and that glucose just gets stored away into the fat cells because the normal cells aren't taking the glucose in, and because it's so elevated, it basically is becoming a toxin for your system. So all of these things, insulin resistance, diabetes, all of the fat gain, all of these things based on endotoxin, based on the microbiome. And if you really want to heal your organism and start to feed your human cells rather than feeding the bacteria, then you really want to start taking these steps, taking the activated charcoal cleanse, taking those kinds of things, and starting to really start shifting the microbiome towards the way that you want it to be. So I hope that you guys got a lot out of this video. Endotoxin is such a big topic and it's so important because it really does underlie all the systems of health. If you think about what your digestive system is, it is the interface between the external reality and your internal physiology. If you have these bad bacteria that are overtaking the interface and blurring it so that there's not a clear transmission between inside and outside, that's when we start to have these problems crop up. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with anyone who you think might like it, and make sure you click the subscribe button for more future content. Like I said, the Amplified Vitality monthly newsletter, November edition, is live in the Patreon account. Make sure you check that out. And I will talk to you guys again very soon. Peace.